please welcome the great David Gregory. So let's get right to it, and we'll have plenty of time for audience questions. We are 1 month out, and some people are saying this is the most consequential election in their lifetime. Others are saying this is the most consequential election in American history. Assess that, this sort of the hyping of the consequential nature of this election.
Look, I think it's incredibly important. Where it ranks, I think, depends a little bit on where you're coming from. I don't want to go too high. All right, that's better. Where your perspective is, I think, we're at a really important moment in the country. We're at a place of continued political division that we've been in for a while, certainly in my lifetime and in my life in journalism. The first campaign I covered in 2000. So they've all been really tight since then. But I think if you think about I always think about the future of the parties, the future of the Republican Party, the future of the Democratic Party. And I do think there's a lot at stake here. I think if Trump were to win again, then the notion of Trumpism is revitalized. And while he would only serve 1 term, we think,
under the Constitution, that's all he
under
gets.
the Constitution, but you never know. But if he were to win, it would not just mean another 4 years, but it would mean that style of politics would be revitalized, and J.D. Vance principally, but others would really be competing to fill that space and to be his successor. If he were to lose, I think it will cause a kind of bloodletting in the Republican Party and the conservative movement that may restore something of a real conservative party again. The Democratic side is a little harder to judge because, it wasn't that long ago that Kamala Harris was not considered a potent political force. And then all of a sudden she was. And so who knows? But what's interesting is that if you look at the ranks of Democrats at the governorship level, they do have a really deep bench. They've got a lot of talent. And President Obama, I think, was correctly faulted for not really building much of a bench in the Democratic Party. But nevertheless, the bench is there and has emerged some. So no doubt this is a consequential election. I think I happen to be more of an optimist about the strength of our democracy, but I think for a lot of people, that's a big issue, and there's certainly a lot of fear there. And given the divisions in the country, this matters. And it matters for one other reason, Clay. I do think we're at an interesting moment about where America is vis-a-vis our presence in the rest of the world and our leadership in the world, which we can get into.
I was just in England for 10 days, and my daughter studies there. And what I came away with is deep, deep, deep European concern about this election. And many European countries bracing themselves for the possibility that there's a second Trump term. And they're not fond of that idea because they see Donald Trump as less committed to NATO and Article 5 particularly, and the international alliances than other people. But I want to go back to this first question, David. So it's not only the parties, each party is saying it's the most consequential election in American history, and if they lose, then that's the end. But it's also the media, and we brought you here in some part for you to help us think about this. If the media is saying that, can that be true? I mean, it's consequential, you just said, but the media, I think, maybe wants this to be more of a drama than it is.
Well, I think that's increasingly true in recent memory. If you follow cable news, the centerpiece of cable news is politics and only politics. The determination has been made that that is the story because cable wants to cover one story. And in breaking news, they'll cover different stories, but they want to cover one dominant story. And certainly in the Trump era, the one story is Trump and the reaction to Trump. So as a result, you're right. The media narrative is, I think, a kind of reductive narrative about the high stakes of the election, the return to Trump. And again, I don't want to put my thumb on the scale one way or the other, but there's no question that there are legitimate concerns about Trump returning to power, given the circumstances under which he left power, an attempt to deny the election in 2020, which I think can be asserted objectively as just flat wrong, January 6th. But there are a lot of Americans, there's tens of millions of Americans, perhaps there's even a majority of Americans who may think that in fact a return to Trump for America is a good thing. So you're right, the media plays a role in generally hyping a tight election because, let's be honest, there's not too much to say right now. It's really close. If you ask me who's going to win, I don't know. And nobody knows. Nobody can tell you who's going to win. And honestly, it doesn't matter what happens between now and Election Day outside of some major intervening event. The candidates are going to spend all their time in 7 states. They're going to spend a ton of money. Barack Obama's going to be out there. George Clooney will tweet. And you're not going to miss much. And then we'll figure out what happens on Election Day, except you won't figure it out on Election Day because you're not going to know for at least a couple of days after that.
So when I turn on, say, MSNBC, and I'm not singling them out necessarily, but almost every minute there's a huge sign at the bottom that says, breaking news, Kamala has a cold. And so this kind of, another thing that's happened to media, hasn't it? That everything's breaking news, everything is made to seem dramatic, the music is heavily produced, the chyrons are. There's this whole sort of world of super producing what is, after all, news.
Again, I think we're talking about cable news.
Right.
And cable news occupies a bigger space in perhaps our brain than it should. And that's really up to us. We're out here in beautiful Vail. We were talking today, Dale and I and some others, about, instead of asking, what do you do? People say, well, like, what do you do? Like, literally, what do you do? What do you do on the mountain? What do you do on the bike path? And so there's a little bit of, it's up to us to recognize that cable news has a certain place, and you can figure out what that place is. Social media has a place. But there's a lot of great sources for news and information that are not as breathless. Cable news is a business built around the breathlessness around campaign coverage, and it doesn't always warrant it. It just doesn't, as you said. And as I'm saying, there'll be a lot of breaking news between now and Election Day, and as it applies to the campaign, it's unlikely to be, breaking. I mean, unless we got information about Trump's health, which he's been withholding. If, there's some dramatic shakeup, if there's, something related to the January 6th investigation with Judge Chutkan. Things like that intervene are legitimately, potentially seismic campaign events.
So you're no longer in the arena in quite the way you were for all those many years, 25 years, and for 6 years, having the most prestigious media job in America, moderating Meet the Press. And I've just been trying to think of what that pressure cooker must be like. But now that you're not, you have some breathing space, and you can look in a little bit from the outside. And as you do that, do you try to bifurcate your life as a citizen from your life as a reporter?
I do. I feel a little bit more freedom, a little less pressure, a little bit less fear of scrutiny. I was saying, we had dinner last night, I'm not quite at the Jodie Foster phase where I just don't care at all anymore, but I'm getting a lot closer. And it's mostly because I don't have to worry about that level of scrutiny anymore. So yeah, I think a lot about my citizenship, my engagement, what I know, how I interact with people, how I think we all have a responsibility to think about how we speak about these issues amongst each other. Because there's a lot you can say that's wrong about media, and I'm happy to go through it. There's a lot that's wrong with politics, I'm happy to go through it. But we bear responsibility. People say that, oh, well, this is not America. Trump was elected. I was like, oh, yeah, it is. It is. It is who we are. It is who we are. In fact, 60 million of us voted for Trump. So it is who we are. We are a complex, big country, urban, rural, and there's a lot of attributes there. So I try to get some space. I try to think about what is constructive engagement, try to listen to people. And there's a lot of issues, where that can be really difficult. But part of the stakes piece is that I think we are, at some level, a lot of us, most of us, maybe all of us, are thinking about this campaign and the election as some kind of referendum on who we are. Not just what people believe, but who are we as a country? What do we value? And what does our leadership say about us? And I mean, that's a fair concern, and it's a big issue because we are, we're moving through a lot of change. The only thing that I tend to push back on is that somehow we've never seen anything like this before. I mean, you care so much about history and chronicle so much of history, and I'm interested in being a student of history, and I think that provides context, sometimes comfort, sometimes not. But there's a lot of analogs in our history to where we are.
I think I know the answer to this question, David, but do you miss it? Do you wish you were in the arena now at this really incredible moment in American political history?
Once in a while, but then I get over it. I've thought about that. There's definitely times. So the thing about being on TV in general, but being in TV news, is that as a kid, I used to watch in my room when I was not doing my homework as well as I could have, and I would watch the evening news, and I thought, I want to be in this place and reporting and know that there's somebody on the other end watching me in their den or in their, and I always loved that. And sometimes I think about that I want to be in that space, saying something, reporting on something that people find edifying or interesting, and so I miss it, but I don't miss the toxicity. I don't really love the news industry anymore. I enjoy consuming it, but I'm not a big fan of TV news. I just don't think it's that interesting. I don't really watch it. And there's exceptions to that. There's some terrific people who are friends of mine and colleagues. But in general, I find that, no, I don't miss it. And it's not as important to me as some of my other pursuits.
But you sort of cut your teeth on the O.J. Simpson trial. You met your wife in Denver, Colorado, while covering the Timothy McVeigh trial for the Oklahoma City bombing. You were at ground zero with President Bush when he had the megaphone and said those heroic words, some of the most inspiring words of that period. You've been all over. You were in Montana, I think you told me, when the Monica Lewinsky story broke.
And then the Unabomber copped a plea the next morning, and we were looking for another cabin.
You know what David Letterman said about the Unabomber? His brother finally turned him in, and David Letterman said, yes, he was turned in by the Unisnitch. So you were there, all right. But my point is, you've been at some of the great dramatic flashpoints. The wall came down in your lifetime. You've seen so much, and you were central to much of it. I think you told me that when the Lewinsky story broke, when bin Laden was taken out in 2011, you were called by Tom Brokaw and said, get in there, go right to the studio.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to, look, the 90s in particular, I was coming up as a journalist, and my wife is Beth Wilkinson, who prosecuted the Oklahoma City bombers, and I was covering the McVeigh case, and I had covered the Simpson cases, the OJ cases, and I came out and I was 26, and I remember going up to her and introducing myself to her, and she was with my friend Dan Abrams, who at the time was maybe at Court TV or maybe he was at ABC, and I was David Gregory with NBC News, and she looked up and she said, hi. And and then I was courting her, even though,
Did she know it?
Yeah, because so we went out to dinner in Denver, and I said to the major, I said, look, we were a few journalists, we were taking out the prosecutors, and I said, this woman's going to come in. Her name is Beth. I want you to seat her with me and say, you must be with Mr. Gregory. You give her a glass of champagne. And so I had all this orchestrated. So she was pretty impressed. And so we're chatting, and then she asked how old I was, and she's 8 years older than me. And so she laughed in my face. And but as I like to say, we've been married for 24 years. We have 3 children and multiple homes. And I was like, who's laughing now? But part of that to find true love, which is one of the reasons I part of my heart is always in Colorado, because I found true love here. But to find your true love while you're doing what you love, and while she was doing what she was best at, and which was just an incredibly important moment in her career, that we got to find each other in that circumstance, is kind of a double whammy, because during the 90s and then obviously in 2000 and beyond, you're right, I got to be not just a spectator, but really a front row spectator, not a participant, but a front row spectator on history. And it's endlessly fascinating and lives in my head and heart to this day. But it's also, how to say this, it kind of, it wears on you. It wears on you. There's some space in my head, at least, where I was filled up. And so you ask, do I miss it? There's things that I miss about what I've done, and some of the best platforms in media that I think are so valuable, that yes, I do miss those from time to time. But I guess I feel quite full that I got to do everything I was able to do.
So you have a reputation for being a penetrating asker of questions, and sometimes a little unrelenting. And so the public had that sense of you. Fair, I think you had high marks for fairness, but you weren't going to allow these politicians to just back away or evade the questions. And there are famous moments when you confronted President George W. Bush. But it turns out you were friendly, and even arguably friends. He celebrated your 30th birthday with a cake on his plane.
Yeah, that story may be apocryphal, because I actually don't
it's
remember
in your book.
this. No. Well, there may have been some reference. I don't actually remember this, but it may have happened. You say it maybe, but I just remember reporting about that. But I can't see it in my head. Two things about that. One, I would never describe us as friends, but we had, as I said, he used to say to me, he'd say, "Gregory, you and I have a symbiotic relationship. I need you and you need me." And what people didn't understand, especially Fox News, that dined out on the idea that I was some villain, is that he considered me extremely fair. And I had a lot of respect for him, and I do now. What's interesting, I'm 54 years old. I was covering Bush, and I was 29 and, turning 30. And I have to admit, I was pretty immature and obnoxious at times. And in that zealotry and that questioning, and I sometimes talk about this with Beth, if I were doing that now, I don't think I'd be that way. And you could argue I may not be as effective. So with some maturity comes some perspective, which I think would aid me greatly, and I think would help my reporting. But I think there was some exuberance that I had that I'm not sure I'd have now. And so it's kind of interesting to think about. He, though, always understood that when he said that about somebody, like he knew he needed somebody like me, and I'm sure he was happy that I was that exuberant and obnoxious at times, because he could just use me as a foil, which was, Trump has taken that to a different level, which is kind of a put on. It's not even real, but all presidents have it where they can. I mean, the media is so easy to go after.
So as we approach the election, we've been really in this election now for 3 years. Do you think that the reporters that you see when you do watch television are rigorous enough? Are they asking enough hard-headed questions? Are they really pinning down these politicians? Or do you think that there is because of the silo effect and the echo chambers, that we've lost some of that rigor?
No, I think the Trump did a lot. I thought there was a Trump effect that I didn't like, which was he was so toxic and nasty and so personal that it caused a kind of counter effect, which forced some reporters, to be so oppositional and so confrontational that I think it kind of got in the way. I've often thought about how I might have approached that and questioning of him. And I think, I might have tried to go toe to toe with him and say, like, I'm not going to be intimidated by you. You know, I've seen a lot, you know, or I might just have not taken that bait. But I do believe it's very important, you know, especially when you're dealing with the White House. It's a huge public relations machine coming at you, and you have to push back. You have to push back on everything. And any politician worth their salt should be able to answer tough questions and be stress tested on a daily level. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't have perspective or respect, but you should be pushing. Your mindset should be to push, because they're not interested in being candid with you, which is not to say that they're lying. I think in many cases Trump did lie and deliberately lied. But it's, you know, they mean to obfuscate, they mean to emphasize in certain ways. It's just a different, they're playing something of a game that's about going over reporters' heads. So yes, I do think that pushing needs to be there. And I don't think it's gone away. A lot of people bring up Biden, and you know, the Democrats and in the White House, they were bullies toward reporters who questioned anything about his health. And there's a lot of manipulation that goes on, and because the media tends to be center left, trust me. And a lot of those people in Washington have relationships with the Biden people going back decades. And they really put their thumb on the scale to try to not just dissuade people, but push them hard about questioning anything having to do with his health. And of course, Fox went so overboard that it kind of it made the question a caricature, which it was not, as we now know.
So let me ask the question in a different way. We now have an unbelievably media-saturated culture. You know, we have the networks; they still exist. We have lots of cable. We have the social media. Everyone is a podcaster. I mean, there are thousands of podcasters by people like you, people who are distinguished in the field. We still have AM radio to a certain degree. We have newspapers, not too many in print, but there's a printed daily here in the Valley. We have a very, very, very wide range of media. And my question is, as we approach the next 4 weeks, do the people of the United States have the tools they need to make the decision they need to make about what, by any measure, is a consequential election?
I think we do. I think there's a paradigm shift. It used to be that we would assemble and maybe watch an evening newscast. Maybe you like watching the morning programs, and I'm speaking about the networks. Maybe you have a favorite, you know, cable news show. You know, it could be Rachel Maddow, it could be Hannity, it could be something in between. It could be, you know, Brett Baer or an Anderson Cooper. You may have appointments in your mind to say, I want to get caught up. But chances are there's no real center of gravity anymore except for big events. And, you know, the Biden-Trump debate was a seismic event. I mean, let's take a step back and say, whoa, I've never seen anything like that in my lifetime. Certainly not in my career, that a moment would unravel a sitting president and he would step down. I mean, still incredible when you think about it. But there's still no real center of gravity because information is coming to you in so many different ways. It could be a group text that you're on in your family. You could be on Facebook. It could be on social media. All this stuff is coming to you and starting to inform you, form your opinions, and you're reaching out to some of it in your own communities. It's harder to break through. And I don't know that there's a lot of people that the audience would say, oh yeah, if they say, you know, this is what's going on, then this is what's going on. You know, Tim Russert is gone, and that brand is gone. And I think even if he were here, he would struggle to break through and have the same influence that he had.
So give us some advice. We have 1 month. Tell us how we can prepare. What kind of media should we turn to? What are useful ways for us to use our limited amount of scrutiny?
Well, first of all, I think it's a question of understanding. I think in our conversations with each other, I often find, you know, people get into, well, you know, who are you going to vote for? Oh, you're going to vote for this person? Well, how could you do that? You know, what does that say about you? Or, well, what is it that's most important to you? I put the question differently, which is, what are you willing to compromise on? We could probably stipulate that neither candidate is perfect. So my whole thing is, what are you willing to compromise on? And if you go back, there's people who compromised on Bill Clinton because they thought he had all these other redeeming values. Same was true of Trump in 2016. I have somebody who works with our family who voted for Hillary and then Trump. How does that happen? We had those conversations. So I think trying to understand people in conversations might open your own eyes. In terms of media sources, again, what is it you'd like to learn? What's important to you? If you already know how you're going to vote, then keep doing what you're doing. I don't think there's going to be some revelation between now and election day that if you're open to voting one way versus another, then what matters to you? If you want to find out what the candidates stand for on particular issues, you can find that. You can Google it. All the major, dailies, the Times, the Journal, they've covered these issues. Podcasts have covered these issues. But I think there are some really good podcasts. I think, the New York Times Daily does a very good podcast, but there's others on the left and on the right. I read the Times, I read the Journal, but I read everything trying to understand where people are coming from and trying to understand, well, what am I going to find edifying? What's going to make me think? Yes, I'd want to see, I think only Kamala Harris is going to sit down with 60 Minutes. I'd want to see that. Trump is not going to do that, and that's too bad, right? Because they should both. And you know what? I think Kamala Harris has done a really poor job of exposing herself to the media. Now, I'm not going to whine about that from a media perspective. Of course we're going to whine about that. But I think she's actually hurting herself writ large, and she needs to be able to answer tough questions and be in uncomfortable situations. I don't think she's done a great job at that before. And by the way, it may not matter. I mean, Donald Trump was elected president, so a lot of things that we think matter, we think are norms, he demonstrated that they're not. So yeah, I think there's lots of things to do. I think there's lots of good sources, but what it comes down to is this idea that we have to be selective and we have to try to understand where people are coming from in terms of our sources.
I know that you're probably going to be annoyed by this question, but so let's say that Donald Trump wins. Very good chance. Does Kamala Harris concede and game over?
I think that's an interesting question. I don't find it annoying at all. I think there's a good chance that there's litigation on both sides. So I think the Democratic side, I don't think Kamala Harris would do anything like Trump did. But I think they'll take a really hard look at any disenfranchisement, any voter intimidation, and I think there's legions of lawyers who are prepared to look at this and perhaps bring lawsuits. And I think, the state of the race is, it's extremely tight in the 7 races in the 7 states that matter, and it's almost unprecedented how tight it is, which is why, this is really about who shows up at this point.
So let's say that Donald Trump wins. Does any part of you imagine a scenario in which Kamala Harris says the election was rigged, the election was stolen, and she urges her compatriots to march on Washington on the day?
I don't imagine that. I think that she and the campaign would be more likely to push the case legally.
In the courts.
Yeah, to push it in the courts. I just don't think that that's I don't see that scenario.
Okay, so let's say that Kamala Harris wins. There's a good chance of that. Do you think that Donald Trump gives a gracious concession speech and goes back to New York?
No, I don't expect that. He doesn't have the power of incumbency, which may matter, but I think he too could litigate. He, I think, would be far more likely to try to incite activity, whether it's violent or not, for people to get in the streets, or to try to put pressure on election officials. That I do worry a lot about, is the pressure on election officials in the important states and counties. That I worry about. But again, I think that as a legal matter, they're going to be kind of loaded for bear on both sides.
Do you think that should she win and he announces that it was rigged and stolen, that there will be any widespread street violence in the United States?
I mean, it's possible. It's not a fear that I live with all the time. I really don't. I just, I don't see it. I mean, I think there certainly can be some violence. I mean, we lived through January 6th, but no, I just don't. I don't expect that, but I certainly think that there could be pockets of it. I think the way things go on Election Day and the voter experiences will have something to do with that.
Do you believe that we will know who won the election sometime between the 5th and the 10th of November?
Yeah, I think there's a good chance. I think we have to hold open the possibility, and I actually think it's more likely for Harris than for Trump, that her turnout is bigger than we might think and that she wins slightly more decisively. And the reason I say that is because I think the constituent groups on the left are likely to be more animated, angry, passionate. She can tap into younger voters. There's an analog for this. I have a hard time, and the caveat here is myself and many others in 2016 didn't think that there were, all of these inconsistent voters or voters who hadn't voted in a while. We didn't think they were going to come out, and they did. And he turned them out. I'm having a hard time thinking that the people who didn't vote for him in 2020 are somehow going to come back in large numbers. Or the people who were turned off by January 6th, reading the new filing or hearing coverage about that, are not somehow turned off a little bit from that. I think there's a lower ceiling for him than for her. And that's just kind of my gut and looking at some of our recent experience.
And we're being warned that there will be certification crises in different states and bullying and intimidation and who knows what. Can you imagine a scenario, David, in which we don't really know what happened by January 20th, 2025?
So I just go back to my experience in the 2000 campaign, which sounds like ancient history because it was, but if you read Evan Thomas's very good biography of Sandra Day O'Connor, one of the things that she says is, again, and this is a highly controversial point and debatable point, but they wanted to bring closure to this. I still think the court would want to bring some closure to this to head off an ongoing crisis. But I mean, that was just one state. So it's certainly possible that there's that kind of stalemate.
We live in an unprecedented
Absolutely.
moment here. So
yeah.
I'm going to turn to the audience here in just a moment. I want to do a couple of quick things. First of all, I want to just tell you how much I enjoyed your book. And we had dinner last night, but I'll tell you what really bugs me about you. And so you're on this spiritual quest. You decided a number of years ago to get serious about your faith, and you're on this spiritual quest. And so then in your book you're saying, well, I asked Cardinal Dolan what he thought. And I thought, my pastor at my congregational church won't return my calls. Cardinal Dolan will talk. Anyone you want to consult will talk with you. And at dinner last night, you said, oh, you had this dinner because, you're a Washington power couple, and there was the deputy prime minister of this and that. And then like fifth on your list was Tom. And we said, who's Tom? Oh, Tom Friedman. So, I mean, you have a really extraordinary access, even when you're no longer the king of the hill. There's no one who won't take your call. No, Cardinal Dolan's not going to help me in my spiritual journey.
Right. Look, I mean, it's very fortunate. I mean, being on TV definitely has its advantages. There's no two ways about it. My wife, the biggest joke we have is that, when I left Meet the Press, even years after that, people would come up to me and they'd say, don't miss you on Sunday, never miss you. And I'm like, oh my gosh, thank you. That is so nice. Thank you for being such a careful viewer. And just the other day, somebody walks up to me and says, oh God, you must be so crazy busy right now. And I'm like, you have no idea. You have no idea how much golf I'm trying to play. Now I'm going out to Vail, and I was in Italy. It's exhausting. And so anyway, but you're right. I mean, having that platform, when I started Meet the Press, my wife, who was the general counsel at Fannie Mae at the time, she said to me, look, a lot of you guys in the news media who don't know anything about the financial system, you really need to learn some things. So I reached out to Jamie Dimon, and as one does.
As I do every day, yes.
and he agreed to see me. And so I spent the day with him. And at one point I said, how do you, basically, don't you have other stuff you have to do besides hang out with somebody like me? But, the two things. I mean, the power of TV, the power of Meet the Press was extraordinary, and having been, at the White House was amazing. And it's a great it's obviously it's very heady, as my dad used to say. I mean, it's so stimulating to be able to do that, and you can learn a lot. But you also have some sense, and even now I have a sense of, that it is ephemeral. It's not, I can't do what I used to do. I have friends now, and I play golf with Tom Friedman, so I can invite him over. But, but you're right that, and even friends of mine in the spiritual world, in the religious world, used to say to me, David, you don't understand that you're getting to see a certain side of some of these leaders. And in this case, these were women, more spiritually liberal women, and that, you're reaching out to these pretty conservative male religious figures who are responding to you and showing you a certain side, and we see something very different. And I thought that was very fair. But, I had incredible access to Cardinal Dolan. I went to go see Joel Osteen, and as well as other people. So it was very interesting.
Joel sits down with you for a couple of hours, and you have a nice chat about God and life.
We did.
So I just have two more questions, and then we'll turn to the audience. So, number one, you mentioned Tim Russert, and so I was at the museum in Washington, D.C. before it closed. It was a fabulous place. And they had his studio, and they left it just as it was.
His office and his studio, yeah.
And so it's like a shrine, a shrine to Tim Russert. Talk about big shoes to fill. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, that was pretty hard. You wouldn't pass the opportunity. But it was very difficult because it was, there was a sense of trying to measure up, but then also recognizing that the world was shifting in the media, and I had to try to evolve the show. And so those two things at once were a lot. They were a lot to handle, I have to say. And there were a lot of ups and downs with that. And again, nobody would feel sorry for me, and I wouldn't feel sorry for myself. It was an incredible opportunity to be able to do that. But, as I look back on that period of time, I think I would have done a lot of the same things, but tried to be as focused as I could on wearing my own shoes and being my own person, because you have to do that, and sometimes it takes time to get past that period where people are looking for something and expecting something, and that level of TV news in a way is kind of like politics. I always say that the biggest figures in news, and you could even make this argument about politics, are not guys from Los Angeles. I think of, yourself, your background. I think about Brokaw being from South Dakota. I think about Carson being from Nebraska. And I was a Jewish guy from LA whose father was a Broadway producer. I'm like, I'm screwed. There's no way I'm going to be quite as relatable. And I don't know, there's something to that. I think one of Tim's innate qualities was he connected to people and with people, and he understood politics in a way that was very deep, but very relatable. And that's a gift, and we all use what we got and do the best we can with it.
So then there's the question of the earpiece. So you're talking to some of the most powerful people on earth, and you say B-29 bomber, and someone says B-52, you idiot, and they're barking at you the whole. How do you listen and talk at the same time?
I actually was in a very good rhythm with my producer, who was Tim's producer, a woman that I went to college with, Betsy Fisher, who was very, very good, and she would sometimes be having a dialogue with me in my ear, and it would be more like she'd be reacting to things as I was listening to things, and she would just say, and there were times I might make a gesture like this, or I might almost in real time repeat something that she had said, or I might think about it, and I did have the ability to completely tune out anything else that was going on and just focus on being on TV. And my wife does marvel at this, because I always say that, to me, there's no difference being on TV and not being on TV. It's all the same thing. And it took me a while to have that. I didn't always have that. My heart used to, jump so much in my chest. But then over time, that didn't happen. And I remember we were on the I was doing Meet the Press, and we were going to interview the Secretary of Defense, who was abroad, and I think there had been an escape, like a soldier who went AWOL in Afghanistan, and so it was a big story, and we were doing that, and we were literally 30 seconds from going on the air, and we didn't have the satellite feed to the Secretary of Defense. And I always remember this guy in high school debate who I really admired, and he used to use all of their prep time for his partner. So he would stand up at the end with no prep time and just stand up and say, let's talk about the issues. And so I always felt like, you just do that. If you have to come on the air, like you just say, hey, good morning, let's talk about the issues.
So you brought up Tom Brokaw.
Yeah.
And word on the street is that you have a pretty good Brokaw impersonation.
I do.
So let's have a
but the only thing is,
a little Tom Brokaw.
I always made a vow, and since this is being broadcast, that I won't do it in this session, right? Because you're putting this out somewhere. So I always made a promise that I wouldn't do it where it's recorded, out of respect for Tom. Although, but I did do this. I did a whole video of him. Where I'm interviewing President Bush.
The actual President.
The actual President Bush, and it was for Tom's retirement. And I wrote this whole script, and the White House said, he's not going to do this. This is just not appropriate. And then it turns out at the last minute he says, okay, I'll do it. And he memorized the whole script. And so the gag was that I was Tom, just interrupting Bush all the time, which Bush hated. And so I'll give you one snippet where I came out. Well, thanks so much, Mr. President, for being with us. Of course, this is quite a heady time to be in the Rose Garden. And the president says to me, he said, well, Tom, of course, I know you have a lot of experience here, too. Well, thank you, Mr. President. Of course I do, but this is not about me. But I do remember being here with Ronald Reagan. The old Gipper who said to me, well, Brokaw, looks like things have worked out pretty well for both of us.
Hey ho.
So that's all you get.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. So as we go to the audience, they're going to go with microphones and make your comments or questions short, and we'll also take some from the streaming. What's the question? This is sort of a trick question for you, but it's right out of your playbook. What's the question that should be asked of you in Vail, Colorado in 2024? What's the question that you would ask of you if you were the relentless interviewer?
Well, I think everybody's going to have great questions, but here's a question because I think you'll like the answer. One of the things that's lost in my view in journalism, and Trump has a lot to do with this, but even still, relationships matter. If I'm in a position where I am privileged enough to be the chief White House correspondent covering the White House, I hope that if you watched me during those years, that you came to rely on me or my colleagues for some insight and I hope fair-mindedness, but also the insight that is reliant on my relationship with the president, which was not some kind of, private friendship or anything, but I'd been up close with him for all 8 years. I had a sense of him, and we had this kind of back and forth. And the best story that exemplifies this is in the run-up to the Iraq War, we are in Western Europe, and there's mass protests everywhere, and people are really, if you think back to that time, people were very opposed to President Bush. So we're at the Élysée Palace in Paris, and I had studied in Paris as a student, and I speak French, and I asked President Bush at the press conference with President Chirac, with whom he did not get along, I said, Mr. President, why is it that you think so many people in this part of the world dislike you so intensely? And, what would you say about that? And then I said in French to President Chirac, would you comment on this as well? And you would have thought I had committed a war crime. President Bush took off his translation headsets and he said, Gregory, what are you doing? He says, guy memorizes 4 words in French and he plays like he's intercontinental. And so bear in mind, this is being broadcast around the world. And I'm a TV guy, so I'm like, I don't just speak 4 words of French. And so I said, Mr. President, I could go on. He said, really? I'm impressed. Que bueno. He said, now I'm literate in 2 languages. And Chirac, of course, is looking at this like, I don't like you. This is not funny. So Bush never lets it go. He said, Gregory, what was that? I mean, I talk about Tim. I had to call Tim, and I said, Tim, we've had an incident. And he just starts laughing, and he said, doesn't Chirac speak English? And I'm like, what does that have to do with anything? I said, I'm in France speaking to the French president, and I happen to speak French. I think it's kind of my father didn't send me to do this without using it. Bush never let it go. He was in the cabinet room, and Tom Daschle was there, and he just points and said, that's the guy who spoke French to me. The president of Poland comes, and the guy looks up to the invitation. He said, do you speak Polish? He said, no, Gregory here speaks French. We go back to Paris the next year, and this time we're in the private office of Chirac, and Bush interrupts and says, Mr. President, I brought back my French-speaking reporter. So I tell you all this because it's funny. And two, I actually think that while this is not personal to me, because I think that Bush, thought that anybody who spoke French was pretentious, but it gave you some insight into this back and forth that we had that, believe it or not, there was a certain credibility I had with him because I was unafraid to be myself at any moment with him. So it built up trust and friendship. Not friendship so much, but more trust and credibility over time.
But when this book came out, he sent you a couple of gracious notes.
He did, and How's Your Faith? The title comes from the fact that I was studying with a biblical scholar, and he found out about that, and I've always been very admiring of his faith journey, which really was his sobriety, and he asked me on a couple of occasions. He said, Gregory, how's your faith? And I write about it in the book. I found it such a deeply penetrating and honest question that was so thought-provoking. And we were around dinner last night, and I said, it's kind of like the difference when somebody says, how you doing? How are you? And how are you? When you get that from somebody, and it can bring you to tears, because all of a sudden you realize they're really, and so that question, how's your faith, really, led me into a kind of search. And I was already on that path, but that's why I named the book. So he didn't cooperate. He thought it'd be too personal, but he was certainly very gracious and supportive because I did write about him and his path.
So it might not have been a friendship, but it was a rich relationship.
It was, and I consider that. I just don't want to sound presumptuous. I have tremendous affection and respect for him, and I can also be incredibly critical of him, and I can do both in the same side of my brain. But I thought I think he is an elegant person. I thought he held himself in high regard. I thought he made some deep mistakes. But I thought he was a person of incredibly high integrity, and I respected him. And I thought that, I don't just think that now in comparison to other people, I thought that then. So, yeah.
Let's go to the audience. Raise your hand. They'll try to get to you. We'll do as many as possible. Please be quick.
We're going to start online. Reporters seem to give one candidate a free pass on making false statements and telling lies. Acknowledging the difficulty of holding a person to account, how is allowing a pass for a candidate acceptable with respect to the standards of journalistic professionalism?
Yeah, I don't think it is. I mean, I think their question reflects a certain perspective about that, and I've been on the receiving end of that. I mean, there's no question you could ask me or nothing negative you could say about me that already hasn't been said, so I'm not too worried about it. But, I understand where that person is coming from, and I think I just can, relate, especially being, in the chair at Meet the Press, how much you follow up, whether you follow up, when you follow up, the extent to which you try to rebut something is all a little bit more art than science, but it is certainly never appropriate to give one candidate a pass and not the other. I mean, that's not fairness. And I think what's challenging now is that in this media ecosystem, anyone who purports to be independent and straightforward or fair-minded, or everybody has a bias, but it really purports to be fair is suspect. I bet all of us in this audience would say, hey, wait a minute, you say you're this, well, but you're not this because you did that and you did this. And I think that just comes with the territory, and it's the way it is.
Just to follow up just quickly, so I think it's fair to say that Donald Trump is unique. Now, there are historical precedents, but I'm guessing that in every newsroom in this country, there has been a long, sometimes difficult debate about how do you cover this person who has such a hold on tens of millions of people in America, who clearly says things that are hard to assimilate under our norms.
Well, there's that, and then there's just lying, and that,
Right.
and
And
that.
how do you do it? How do you handle
Well, because that became a big issue actually in newsrooms, whether to say he actually lied. I confronted this. President Bush made a decision to lie about his DWI record at the end of the 2000 campaign, and I used those words, and they were very upset about that, and I defended that at the time. But this is a decision about calling someone a liar, which is like a certain amount of premeditation, as opposed to being deliberately evasive or something less than that. I don't know that anybody in the media has kind of reached consensus that is acceptable to everybody. Because the role we still have to play is to try to understand where they're coming from, hold them accountable. It's not our job to cancel them. And a lot of people would like one or the other to just be completely canceled and to exit the stage. It wasn't my job to stand up to President Bush and say, you're a war criminal and you deliberately lied about no weapons of mass destruction. I don't think it was a deliberate lie. And it wasn't, I don't think, my position in that role to level that kind of accusation against him. And I still had an obligation to be fair, and people can make a judgment about whether I was tough enough and all the rest. And we did face a lot of judgment about that. And again, in an ancient era of, the early 2000s.
It's fun to go on and on about this, but let's go to this question. Right into the front.
Just like this. Just hold it just like that.
Megan, do you want this one?
Let's try that.
Maybe they're censoring me already. Thanks, Clay. David, you talked about TV, but my question is about newspapers. And I followed the Post. I used to live in Washington for 50 years. And I've seen a change in the last 4 or 5 years. And talking to reporters there, some of them I know for a long time personally, they talk, it's all about clicks. Would you like to explain the clicks?
Yeah, again, it's just,
Newspaper?
that's the digital environment. I'm sorry, was there something else you wanted to add or
No,
another
that's-
question?
that's wrong.
Yeah, the notion of
Short.
clicks are just, right? It's how we consume news and information. If you're on Instagram or you're on TikTok or, on stories, it's a super short attention span. And so that's what drives people is what content is going to get the most play. One of the things I find really annoying, and they all do it, and the Times does it, is that they won't give you a big write-through of a story because they want you to constantly be updated, because at some level we are so impatient that if we look 20 minutes ago, we look at it's 20 minutes later. We want to see something else in red. We want to see an update. And this is our generation. And that is exactly what you're talking about, is that pressure. And some people are really figuring out that those digital offerings, and some aren't. I think the Times has done a good job. The Journal's done a good job. The Post has its struggles, and they're trying to figure it out.
Well, part of the problem is, the second part of that is the Murdochs installed a sympathizer as head of the Post about a year ago.
Well, that's a
Same-
separate issue, and the Post will figure out its business model. But
I don't
yes,
mean to
they have leadership problems. All right, we're going to take another question.
Okay, thank you.
A moment ago, you mentioned a word, fairness. And I'd like you to maybe address the Fairness Act that was dissolved and how you stand on bringing it back.
The Fairness Doctrine.
Fairness Doctrine.
That's just kind of equal time, right? I think there's an embedded responsibility to think about equal time. I don't know, in this media environment, I'm not even sure what that means. You have entire programs that are dedicated to a singular point of view. So I mean, I think we're kind of in a postmodern, post-fairness doctrine, world. But it comes back to, we have some responsibilities, I think, as what I would call traditional journalists, not advocacy journalists. I don't really like the term mainstream media because it's a pejorative term that the right coined and other people are happy to appropriate. But traditional legacy media that I think still matters, we have some responsibilities, and then you have responsibilities. Your responsibility is that how much fairness are you seeking in the information that comes to you? And unfortunately or fortunately, depending on your point of view, you've got to work harder, because we are in a media ecosystem where we have found business models that mean we only want to broadcast narrowly and not as broadly as we used to.
Also that, the fairness doctrine only applied to stations using public airwaves under the FCC, so cable would be largely exempt from that sort of thing.
Right,
so
and then social media
right,
and all
no,
the rest.
no putting that genie back in the bottle, I'm afraid.
Exactly, yeah.
Raise your hand, they'll get to you. You're going up there.
Oh, hi. I'm curious about the two debates that recently occurred. There were some question about the debate moderators in the presidential debate, and then also to maybe a lesser degree in the vice presidential debate. I'm just curious, were those criticisms fair, or was it sour grapes?
I'm not sure that I'm the one who gets to decide. I mean, you probably, I think, are the one who should get to decide. My perspective is I've been in that position, not for a presidential debate. I think it's very hard. I also am, I'm good friends with and he was my former producer, who was the producer behind the ABC debate. And I actually think they did a good job. Now, I might have handled the follow-up on even the question to Vice President Harris, which he just completely blew off.
The first question.
The first question about the economy, I would have followed up on that. This business of when you fact check and when you don't, and you're going to get criticized. But I like the perspective I try to offer is that the point of the moderator there is not to take over the program and be the umpire fully. It is to get them to debate each other. And President Trump should have turned and said, you know what? She was asked a simple question, which is the economy better now than it was 4 years ago? She didn't answer. And here's why she didn't answer. And, that's what you do in a debate. You take her up. Madam Vice President, why are you ducking questions? There's lots of reasons that they set them up to debate and not always to be the ones to try to take down one side or the other. So I actually, on balance, I was pretty happy with that ABC debate, and I think it's really more just partisanship in your point of view that impacts that.
There's a question up here, and then Chris, would you come and get one down here?
Right here.
As someone, since you were at NBC during the time, I'm curious what you think. To what extent did The Apprentice shape people's impressions, either correctly or incorrectly, of Donald Trump? And what responsibility does NBC have for his political?
Yeah, I mean, other people can make that determination. I mean, the fact that you have a guy who was in a reality TV show who then gets the nomination, is that NBC's fault? I don't know. I mean, Americans were the one who elected the guy. But you're certainly right to ask the question. The Apprentice gave Trump, in my estimation, Trump was always, there was the clownishness of maybe the 70s and the 80s and the tabloid fodder. And then he started to get a little bit more political. But then, the Apprentice raised him in a lot of people's estimations as a successful guy. And what I do think a lot of people don't get about supporters of Trump is that, it turns everything on its head, about, we don't like elitists and all that. Well, he's certainly not an elitist. And a lot of people, and the extent to which he is a rich guy is subject to some debate. But most people look at him and say, hey, I'd like to be like him. He's super successful, and he's doing pretty well. And they liked his attitude and liked that he would say what was on his mind, and it came at a particular moment where he was able to capitalize on and kind of touch that nerve. But there's no question that that kind of platform elevated him in a major way to, I think, being a national figure that he would not have otherwise have been, for sure.
Right there.
What is the government's influence on the media?
What is the government's influence on the media? Well,
Thanks for that question.
thank you, yeah. I mean, the government tries, meaning the administration, the White House. Everybody tries to influence what the story is. It doesn't mean that it's inappropriate influence, it's just usually advocacy. And it's what I was saying earlier, that you have a responsibility as a journalist to push back on that and test that. But there is an effort to influence. This is still a great country with a free press, and there can be instances of, you know, some intimidation, people yelling at you, things like that. But it, you know, we are America with our freedoms, and I hold those dear.
Right up here.
We've got some
I'm
down in the
curious
second
to-
row here too, so please.
Curious to know what you think of the public broadcasting system, particularly PBS NewsHour, as a legitimate and balanced source of news.
Yeah, I think it's okay. I mean, I don't really watch it. I mean, I don't think it's great. I mean, you know, they do a pretty good job. They don't have a lot of resources. So, you know, they're covering stuff out of Washington, but I think they give a good platform for good discussion. And I know the people who do it. I think they're solid. I mean, I don't think it's the McNeil Lehrer NewsHour, but I think the media ecosystem is different. But it's certainly legitimate and credible, and I think a good place. I don't think they're chasing the same rabbits that other media outlets are, and in that way, it's good. I'm still a fan of NPR, and people are critical, thinking you're too left-wing. I think they do a terrific job, and I can quibble with some of what they do, but I'm still a big fan of NPR, and have listened to them for decades.
All right. Well,
Yeah, Dave, you had mentioned earlier, just made mention of it, didn't discuss it too much, of the attack on democracy. And it seems to me that the media has glommed onto that. You can't hardly go 2 nights without hearing that Donald Trump's a threat to democracy. But it seems to me that that's driven more by personality, because they don't describe where that threat's going to come from. I don't hear much from the media, because that's where anybody's going to learn about it, the threat to the democracy based on what has been said by prominent politicians, such as getting rid of the filibuster, making D.C. and Puerto Rico states, stacking the Supreme Court. John Kerry, at a global economic conference, said that the First Amendment is getting in the way of his climate goals. And they've opposed voter ID, Democrats have. And then certainly lawfare, whether it's Donald Trump or JFK.
So you have a question, I hope.
Well,
No, I get your question. I get your question.
We're not
Can I
getting-
respond?
we're not
I mean, you
getting
gave a
there.
lot of examples. I'll take on some of them.
those seem to be more threatening to democracy than
Okay,
Donald
well, you can make that argument, but all of those things that you listed, I don't know the John Kerry line. I mean, I'm obviously, I don't like the First Amendment to be abridged. But all of those things that you were talking about would have to be passed, and you probably would have to change the Constitution, which makes them far-fetched, okay? It is not undemocratic to seek to change the Constitution because it exists as an option in the Constitution. I think what people fear is an effort to block a peaceful transfer of power, which is what President Trump did. I'm just trying to talk directly and understand and respect your point of view, but also take you on in some ways. Blocking a peaceful transfer of power and advancing claims of fraud that somehow it was rigged with 60-plus lawsuits, 0 of which had merit. So, and then denying the election, that is an actual threat to our, not just norms, but to the transfer of power. The other things you talked about, you may think are wrong, They may be contrary to the norms. They may be horrible ideas, but they cannot come to pass without going through a constitutional process to overturn what currently exists. So that would not be a violation of our democracy.
All right, so
I'm not sure. We'll have to take that up separately.
So
I'm not
David,
sure
let me
what you're-
just follow up for a second on this. So I'm sure there are people here tonight and people who are watching on streaming who say, oh, there they go again, it's the liberal bias of the media and so on, anti-Trump. So this is the question for media, so that if Donald Trump says he's going to suspend the Constitution, or he's going to be a dictator on day one, or he's going to, he recently said, we are going to solve the crime problem with a purge for one day, or we'll round up 12 million people and put them in camps. When he says those things, almost any person will recoil somewhat from that in a democracy, right? Because these are really wild things to say, and yet there are tens of millions of people who vote for him, not necessarily for those policies. Maybe they're 401k voters, maybe they're pro-life voters, maybe they're pro-gun voters. How does media make sure that it doesn't seem to have its finger on the scale when he makes it almost impossible not to put your finger on the scale?
I mean, there are going to be deep-seated debates about some of these things, some of which are specious and some of which are worthy of debate. But we live in an ecosystem where some of these arguments are advanced as being truthful, and they are arguments. And sometimes, as a journalist, you have an ability to actually get to the bottom of something, that you can get to the truth. Other times it can be a question of perspective, it can be a question of how you view it. I mean, here, let me give you a good example. The Supreme Court decision about immunity for the president was not about President Trump. It was about the presidency. And for all the liberals who think, oh, this is a free pass for Trump, what happens when a future Justice Department tries to prosecute President Obama for taking out top-level al-Qaeda leaders using drones, saying that that was a criminal act? So you can disagree with it, but there are measures that are taken by the government, including extreme, measures that are done in the name of national security, that the executive has the power to do, unilaterally, that can create huge debate. So bottom line is, you can't satisfy everybody. There are some things I think you can get to the truth on, and I think there's a lot of things you can. That doesn't mean that everybody's going to be satisfied with it. They're still going to put it into the realm of, the media is just ignoring something, and we can't do much about that.
Let's do a few more. There's quite a few down here. Go ahead.
You haven't said too much specifically about disinformation, misinformation, and it just seems like there's a flood of it coming out right now.
That's bad. Disinformation is bad.
Yeah, bad.
So,
bad, really.
look, I think that...
How powerful is it?
I think it's very powerful. I think in the age of AI, I don't think we even understand the extent to which deep fakes and manipulated video and all these things can take hold. I think it's where, we do have to rely on good legacy journalism to try to separate fact from fiction. But look, again, we all have this responsibility. It's like when you get the email saying that, your FedEx shipment was missed, and if you just click on this link, they're going to take care of it. Don't do that. And there's a lot of information that's going to come at you that you want to say, wait a minute, is this real? Is this right? Is this really what's going on? And I, there's been some very manipulative things that the Democrats have done, that the Harris campaign has done, to purport to show things are true that are not true. So, it's not as easy as saying both sides do it. It's about, all the tools at our disposal to try to ferret out what's true and what's not. I think it's only going to get harder, unfortunately.
So, for the past year and a half, I've been sending $500 a month to a Nigerian prince. Am I wrong?
I'm sure that's going to work out for you. Yeah. I'm sure it's going to work out for you.
But I'm sorry.
By the way, I was early on Twitter. I had millions of followers. I was, and then I thought it was all well and good where people were saying, "Oh, this is so great, and we love your show." And then somebody said, "I hope you die," and I realized that things were changing. And then so I was doing less Twitter, and then I got hacked on Twitter. I got hacked, And I didn't know what to do about it. And I had to contact a friend of mine who went to the CEO of Twitter to unwind this. And I thought, this is ridiculous. What is a normal person going to do? So I'm not on Twitter anymore, so it happens to all of us.
Take a few more. We've got about 8 minutes here.
Does morality and character matter anymore? And does America have a moral compass?
You tell me. You're a voter. Does it matter to you? If it matters to you, then maybe it matters to other people. Maybe it doesn't. Maybe some people's vision of morality and character is different than.
Does morality matter? Do we have a moral compass anymore?
Yeah. Does morality and character matter anymore in America? Does America have a moral compass? I think the country does, but I think voters do. But I think the nature of the divisions and the extent to which we are willing to delude ourselves, the extent to which we are willing to shut out different points of view, has hardened our hearts and closed our minds to the point where certain people might view the media or might view politicians, and it is zero sum. We are in a battle royale, and either my side wins or I lose, and the country's going to hell. And there's a lot of catastrophizing, and by the way, some of it may be legitimate. We don't know. We never know if we're in that moment. But what I also know is that people still are ask themselves, like, what am I willing to compromise on? And people across the moral spectrum make those decisions. I asked a guy who I know well, Ralph Reed, who founded the Christian Coalition, is a big organizer for Trump. I knew him back in the Bush days, and I remember saying, how is it that evangelicals can vote for Trump? And he said, David, you study the Bible. He said, even the Hebrews wanted a king. And there was a lot to that. In the Bible, we know that the Hebrews didn't listen to God. They didn't listen to Solomon. They wanted to be like the countries around them. And even though they'd had a horrible experience with kings, they were like, oh no, we need to have a king too. So people compromise. And I think this question of moral character, morality and character, I think offends a lot of people too. Because again, their morality, their character may be defined a little bit differently, but ultimately, that question is not for me. The question is for the deciders, and I am not the decider.
Question here. Go ahead.
David, thank you for coming to the Vail Valley. With your very interesting life, you've written a book on your faith journey, and I'm curious what's the most impactful thing you've learned on that journey?
Well, that's a great question. So I'll share one thing, and I think it's interesting because it came from an unlikely source, and it was Joel Osteen, of all people. I don't know what you think about Joel Osteen. I didn't know what I thought about Joel Osteen. But I went to see him, and I went to his service, which was quite an experience. And I actually thought, because I'm Jewish, and I thought he would be like a lot of more conservative Christians whom I'd met, Protestants and the Catholics, who would say, well, this is all charming that you're, a spiritual seeker, but until and unless you accept Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior, then, you're not really complete. And I said, and I wasn't trying to be flip at all. I was like, Jesus Christ may be my Lord and Savior. I said, I don't know. I'm not there yet. I'm pretty good where I am. I have a lot of respect for Jesus and his ministry. I don't think he's the Christ, but that's just what my faith tradition teaches me. But what he said to me was, I come from a different tradition than you do. All I would say is I think it's important to open your heart to God. And to me, whatever your faith beliefs are, the notion of opening yourself to something bigger, to God or God as you understand a higher power, I think helps us get out of ourselves and try to connect to something larger. And I think that kind of transcendence, however you find it, is good for the soul, and it was good for my soul, and so that was a deeply impactful thing.
And the book is for sale here, and you can get it in your local
Very nice of you guys to do that.
No, and it's a terrific book. Yes.
All right here.
We got 3 minutes here.
Thank you very much for joining us tonight. What information sources do you follow to stay abreast of current affairs?
So, I mean, as I said, I'll listen to NPR in the morning, Wall Street Journal, New York Times. I listen to the Bill Simmons podcast all the time, but that's for sports. I listen to The Daily. I'll listen to Sam Harris, who I like. I read The Free Press by Barry Weiss, which I like. I read The Times of Israel. I read the French press because I speak French. And so I read Le Monde, and I read, but I also read Le Figaro, so I can have a more right-wing perspective from France. So there's some, I think podcasts are good. I certainly don't like, curated social media can be good. I like Instagram, but mostly for golf videos and sports, and somehow I get all of these memes about dachshunds, and I mean, which is fine. I mean, I like dachshunds as much as the next guy, but I don't have a dachshund, and I'm not exactly sure how that happened. But what I do is I'm always thinking about, where is this source coming from, and what is it I'm trying to learn. I also like the Financial Times a lot.
We got one more here.
We have 2 minutes. That's a lot of TV time.
A number of very prominent Republicans have made a decision to speak out to criticize Donald Trump, which takes courage. But conspicuous among them, absent among them, is President Bush.
Yeah.
And I wondered if you have a sense for why that where he is and why that may be.
Yeah, two things. One, when he said he was going to go away, he meant it. Two, he tried this once and it hurt. I mean, he tried to get involved for his brother, and I think he understands he's not helpful. Donald Trump is a repudiation in many ways of George W. Bush. It's a repudiation of his post-9/11 policies. It's a repudiation of his views on immigration, his repudiation of his projection of U.S. power in the world, and I think he thinks he cannot help. I'm not so sure Liz Cheney can help. Maybe. I don't know what the Liz Cheney brand is anymore. I think she's very principled. I respect her. I respect the fact that she hasn't changed any of her views on the other things that liberals don't like about her. But but I think that's the answer. I think ultimately he thinks that it won't be helpful.
Plus, that's an American norm that he chose to follow, that the president who leaves goes largely quiet and is reluctant to interfere.
Clinton and Obama are certainly big. I mean, Clinton less so, but Obama's going to be all over. But that's because he thinks that Harris can inherit his, movement, as it were.
His legacy.
His legacy, and so he'll get very involved.
All right, last word.
I love the last word. I'm married. I never get the last word.
And by the way, if your wife is with you, you're still not.
So I read Bret Stephens, Thomas Friedman, David French.
So you read the New York Times?
Yeah, I do. I read a lot of papers. And I read, and David Brooks, especially today, his article, just brilliant. And I read this with some despair because people who should be reading them aren't. And that's a huge problem because I also have Fox on my right here. I have so many different news sources, and I look at them. But do you think? What do you think? Other people on the other side, do they look at these columnists?
I think generally it's a problem that people are too siloed and they're comfortable being that siloed, and that what they're doing is that they're getting news and information less about having their thoughts provoked, less about being stimulated or to learn things. They want to be fortified. They want ammunition for their debates. And a lot of our media ecosystem is, and of course the greatest one of all at this was Rush Limbaugh. But he was more in the wilderness, and conservatives didn't have the heft in media that they have now. And it's really liberals who have fallen, although there's still plenty of liberal influence in the media. So yeah, I think the problem is that people are not just comfortable, but they are looking for ammunition, and that is not a open-minded way, I think, to live in the world. So kudos to you.
David Gregory, I wish we had a couple of more hours, don't you? So, but I have, and I wish I had time to ask you, what's the deal between Donald Trump and Maggie Haberman? What a weird flirtation that is. But let me ask you one last question. You're a young man. You're in your mid-50s. You've got decades ahead, maybe half a century. You're not done. So what is your plan?
I don't have one as I sit here now, other than I want to continue to get better at golf and speak French, and hang out with my kids and go chase them around, and travel with my wife who's still working, and stay engaged and lend my voice and do some philanthropic and volunteer work. But I don't know. I mean, I don't have an overarching sense of a feeling that I have to do anything. I want to try to be present in the moment and stay healthy and live a really good life.
More books?
I don't know. Not at the moment. Not at the moment. But I'll come back to the Maggie Haberman thing for a second. Trump craves legitimacy, and what does he want more than anything is for the New York Times to legitimize him. And he cannot quit Maggie Haberman, as mad as he gets at her. He calls her personally.
Late, in the middle of the night.
Yeah, I mean, he has her cell phone and would call her, and she's an excellent reporter. But there's something that is that's very New York-centric about that. And Trump, he rails against the Times, but he very much wants the Times' validation. So that's an interesting piece. But as for me, I guess stay tuned. I'm just kind of out there in the world and enjoying my life.
David Gregory.
Thank you all.